A pair of Big Ten guards are reuniting in Seattle, hoping to bring hoops glory back to Washington.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Andy Patton, and you are joining us at the place to get your college basketball content every single day, Monday through Friday, whether it's the off season, middle of the season, whenever it is. We are with you 5 days a week, folks. Want to thank all of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Give a special shout out to those everyday listeners and those of you hanging out with us in the Locked On College Basketball Discord community. And remind you that you can check out the show ad-free on Amazon Music. Also got to give a shout out to FanDuel right now. New customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Well, folks, we got some conference realignment to discuss at the end of the show. We also got a pair of guard additions joining the SEC that we'll talk about as well. But first, I am joined by the great Roman Tomashoff of Locked On Huskies to talk about the biggest news out of Montlake in the Big Ten, the Washington Huskies landing Desmond Claude from the University of Southern California, a Big Ten transfer addition, joining Wesley Yates, who also transferred from USC to Washington. And Roman, let's start here. We heard that Desmond Claude was interested in UW. It was UW, Gonzaga, Alabama was his top three initially. And I know Tyon Grant-Foster from Grand Canyon was also linked at Washington and Gonzaga, as well as Arizona State. Most of you know this listening, but I also host Locked On Zags. And I remember thinking, I didn't expect that Grant-Foster and Claude would split between Gonzaga and Washington. I thought, somebody else will get in the mix or one of them will go to the SEC. But here we are. Grant-Foster lands at Gonzaga. At that point, Alabama got LeBaron Philon back in the NBA draft process, and it kind of felt like the seas had cleared for Desmond Claude to end up in Seattle with Washington. What was your initial reaction finding out that Claude is, in fact, going to be a Husky for next season?
Honestly, it was, finally, because it's one of those things where throughout just this transfer portal process, Washington has done a great job of overhauling this roster, which I'm sure we'll get into. But it's one of those things where, you mentioned Tyon Grant-Foster, Cedric Coward is another name, Darian Williams is another name, where throughout this process, every single big-time wing name that came up at any point, it was, oh, hey, Washington's interested. Oh, hey, Washington's going to try to get into the mix here. Was at least, things that I was hearing just here in Seattle. And just getting Desmond Claude is such a fantastic way to round out a roster that I'm really, really impressed with because he can do so many different things. And, he led USC in points and scoring per game and assists as well last season. So I love to see that because we just looked at what this Washington roster was last season. And it was just kind of a bunch of guys who, all right, is anybody going to show up alongside Great Osobor? And unfortunately for Danny Sprinkle in his first season, a lot of times the answer was no.
And one thing that stands out to me, kind of looking at Washington's pursuit of wings in the transfer portal, like you mentioned, is kind of what that means for the fit for Claude. Because I know when Claude left Xavier after 2 years with the Musketeers, one of the main things he was looking for was an opportunity to kind of be the primary lead ball handler playing on the ball. And he got that. Absolutely at USC. I mean, he was there. He brought the ball up every single time. He was clearly and unquestionably the point guard for Coach Musselman's team with what would be generally considered good results. I think it's also important to acknowledge he led the Big Ten in turnovers and was one of the top, 10 in the country in turnovers. He turned the ball over a lot because he, hadn't typically played that lead guard role. I think, for USC, and it was a roster of 11 new players. So not all those turnovers were his fault, but that is kind of an area of, skepticism around Claude's game at this point. And you kind of mentioned how they were looking at so many other wings, guys like Grant-Foster and Coward and Williams, who would not have played point guard for UW had they committed. So where do you kind of see Claude then fitting in? Do you think he is coming to UW to kind of be that primary on-ball guy? I know they got some other transfers coming in who've kind of played a similar role where they were like the lead player, but also the best player on their roster. Right. So kind of where do you think Claude fits role-wise for the Huskies?
So I really do think he's going to end up playing off ball. I'm really impressed with just what Danny Sprinkle was able to do to just integrate players into his, it goes so far beyond Washington, right? You think about what he was at Utah State and what that team was at Montana State as well, and how he was able to get players to fit into what he wants them to do. And it was something that, as this season kind of went downhill since Washington finished last in the Big Ten, he told us in the media during one of his last couple of games, I need to do a better job of vetting these players through the transfer portal process and making sure that they are going to be good culture fits, not just, good in terms of what they can bring on the floor. So that's one thing that's really important to consider here, because you talk about Kamari Peterson from East Tennessee State, who was the SoCon Player of the Year last year, who averaged 21 points per game last season and did shoot over 40% from long range. But it feels like he's going to be that sort of true point guard mold, since that's what he was asked to do, because behind him, you also have Zoom Diallo, who's coming back for a sophomore season. He was another big time on ball guy last year, and he's still starting to, figure some things out. And I expect him to take a big jump forward this year. And plus you're bringing in a top 50, top 60 recruit in 4-star point guard, JJ Mandaquit, who is just the definition of an old school on ball point guard, who's a pass first sort of guy. So you don't need to have Desmond Claude fill that role. You can have him just kind of be a wing slasher, and we know he's going to be a high-level defender as well. So if you can just have him do that, you can take some pressure off of him with some of these other fantastic additions that Danny Sprinkle has brought in around him.
Yeah, and I think one thing that stands out to me too is when you talk about Claude, and I don't want to keep harping on the negatives, but the other negative for Claude fairly clearly is the three-point shooting. It's just not there. It's never been there. It's never been a part of his game. And I think, again, from putting the Gonzaga goggles on, they desperately needed three-point shooting and couldn't really afford to take on a player who was going to command so much attention, but who couldn't shoot. But Washington's in a position. I mean, Wesley Yates was a phenomenal shooter last year. And then you mentioned Peterson. He shot 42% from three last year. Like, they got some guys who can really space the floor. And it feels like that sort of mitigates some of that concern with Claude. And again, kind of sticking on Yates specifically, like, these two guys played together last year, and Yates was a guy who, took him a little bit to get going. And obviously he'd already been at UW. He redshirted his entire freshman year, left UW after the coaching change, comes to USC. And then in conference play last year, he was unbelievable. I feel like there's so many people who, even like diehard college basketball fans, who sort of missed this Wesley Yates explosion. He was like 18 points, like almost 50% from three for like a 25 game stretch. Like, he was incredible. And you add him, you add Claude, they're familiar with each other. They've already played together. They both kind of had some of their best work of the season playing off each other. Like, it feels like that, combined with a bunch of floor spacers, is a pretty dynamic offensive set for Danny Sprinkle. You feeling like, again, even looking at some of the other additions, Bryson Tucker and Lathan Somerville from Rutgers, like, what do you kind of feel like this new look roster, how the pieces are going to fit together for Coach Sprinkle?
Yeah, so one guy who I think is also going to be really important in this is Lipscomb transfer Jacob Ognisevich, where he was the Atlantic Sun Player of the Year last year, and he also shot 40% from three-point range, where he averaged 20 points and 8 rebounds per game. So you have three guys that are probably going to end up starting in Peterson, Yates, and Ognisevich that all shoot over 40% from deep, which is a great sign. So yeah, it's a little bit easier to take on somebody like Claude, which is one of the reasons that I believe this process took so long, because, I mentioned somebody like Cedric Coward, some of these other guys who were a little bit more just adept at shooting the 3-point ball. But now it's a little bit easier to say, all right, we have all these guys in the rotation. Bryson Tucker, somebody you mentioned, who I really like his upside. I know he missed a bunch of games last year with an injury down the stretch. And another guy who I want to mention that I think is going to really, really help this roster out a lot is German. He's going to come in as a true freshman prospect, Hans Steinbach. He's somebody who he's averaging a double-double right now over in the Bundesliga playoffs, and has just been truly fantastic. Because when we look at what Washington's downfall was last season, there are so many different things you can point to. That just wasn't a cohesive team. There's no depth up front. And I think that's one of the big ones that, honestly, I overlooked for different points of last season as, you start to really learn what Big Ten play is. And it's something where having a guy like that who is experienced overseas is going to come in and be a really, really nice backup to Ognisevich. And I think Frank Kepnong, if he's healthy, is going to be the two starters down there. Plus having Steinbach, plus Lathan Somerville, who you mentioned, and then Matty Traore, one of the top 2 or 3 players in the nation from the junior college ranks, coming in as well to really anchor a strong front court. That, combined with all this backcourt depth that you just went through, this roster has a real opportunity to take a big step forward this season.
Last question for you, and you touched on it perfectly at the end there. There's nowhere to go but up. Like, let's be honest, the only place that they can go in the Big Ten is up for this club. Obviously, it was the first year in the new conference. The travel schedule is the first year of a new coach. Like, I think there was a lot of reasons that you can kind of write off the season and not say like, okay, like we're already out on Sprinkle or anything. Like, you got to give them a little bit more time, especially with getting all the bearings straight. But what's the optimism level going into this season, knowing that, Coach Sprinkle acknowledged some of the things that didn't go well last year. Now you've added to that depth in the front court. You've brought in a talented transfer portal class. You have some key pieces returning who could step into bigger roles like Zoom. You mentioned him. How are folks feeling in, early June here, kind of getting ready for this season, knowing, that it didn't go great last year, but there's a lot of potential upside coming into second year for Coach Sprinkle?
Yeah, I think the general public is still a little bit down on UW basketball as a whole because this team hasn't made the tournament since 2019. So there's a lot of just doubt of like, oh, we want to, see it on the floor first. But you look at the investments that this coaching staff has made in this roster. You touched on the transfer portal class. I fully expect this team to get back to the NCAA tournament. And I really don't think that anything less than a win or even 2 wins in the tournament is going to be seen as a successful season because of just the amount of investments that you've made to really overhaul this roster. What Danny Sprinkle said he needs to see from his group this year. I think we're going to see a big step forward in year 2.
Roman, thank you so much for jumping on, folks. You want to hear more about this team? You want to hear more about the basketball team, the football team, everything going on in Seattle? Check out Locked On Huskies. Great stuff. Thanks again for hopping on.
Thanks for having me.
Folks, speaking of USC guards, the Trojans had High Point's Kezigifa for a second, but he changed his mind and is now headed to Ole Miss. We'll talk about why coming up in just a second. But first, the NBA playoffs, in fact, the NBA finals are in full swing. Every night has delivered highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. So whether it's a game-winning shot like Tyrese Halliburton had or a breakout star, there's never been a better time than right now to get in on all the action. And FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game both before tip-off and live. With player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays, fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. The Thunder are currently 5-point favorites on the road against the Indiana Pacers in Game 3, which is set for Wednesday evening. And folks, if you're new to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. So make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball. Moving away from our conversation with Roman about Desmond Claude and this new look Washington basketball team to instead talk about the SEC and instead talk about a pair of SEC teams that made additions to their roster in the last couple of days. However, we are still going to talk a little bit. It's a seamless transition since we were talking about Desmond Claude and USC guards. We're going to talk about a guy who briefly, and I mean very briefly, was with Eric Musselman in the USC Trojans. That's Kezigifa. He's a 6'2" French guard from High Point, and he originally committed to Coach Musselman and the Trojans like a week, 10 days ago or so, as we're recording this right now. And then just a few days later, he decommitted from USC and ended up landing at Ole Miss for Coach Chris Beard and the Rebels. USC, in response to that, or perhaps ahead of that, the timeline's a little fuzzy. It was announced after Gifa had decommitted from USC and went to Ole Miss that USC was bringing in Dartmouth guard Ryan Cornish. It's possible that they were pursuing him already or that there had been talks, and that's why Gifa ended up decommitting and choosing to go elsewhere. Cornish, for his money, very, very talented player, 17 points, a little over 3 assists, 1.5 steals per game last year for Dartmouth. USC has brought in a lot of very talented guards, not just Cornish, but also Chad Baker-Mazara from Auburn, Rodney Rice from Maryland, Jordan Marsh, I believe from UNC Greensboro. Very, very talented group of guards joining Coach Musselman's team next year. Kezigifa will not be among them, although he is also a very talented guard who will instead be joining what's going to be a pretty new look roster for Coach Chris Beard at Ole Miss in the SEC as well. Gifa, 34 games last year, started all of them for a very, very good High Point team that was picking up AP votes throughout the season, which is very rare for mid-major schools like that. He played 28 minutes a game, averaged 14.5 points, 2.5 assists. Was not a great three-point shooter, 31.5%, but on a pretty good volume, about 4 3-point attempts per game. He's also a tremendous free throw shooter and incredibly good at getting to the free throw line. Last year, he shot 85% from the charity stripe on over 5.5 attempts per game. The previous year at High Point, he was 88% from the line, and that was on a whopping 7.5 attempts per game. So he is very good at getting downhill, very good at getting to the rim, and incredibly good at finishing from the free throw line. He becomes the 6th transfer portal addition for Coach Chris Beard and Ole Miss, a team that had 6 players in double figures last year, but lost all of them, I believe, or 5 of those 6 from last year's roster. So lots of rebuilding needing to be done. In the backcourt, we have seen Ole Miss add AJ Storr from Kansas, who, of course, has had a very up and down career, is on his 8th school in 8 years, 4 different high schools, then was at St. John's, Wisconsin, Kansas, and now at Ole Miss. Was not particularly good at Kansas last year, but was great at Wisconsin the previous year. So it'll be interesting to see how he looks for Coach Beard in the SEC. They also had Travis Perry from Kentucky, who didn't play much for the Wildcats, but was the all-time leading scorer in the state of Kentucky out of high school. Corin Johnson from Louisville, who was also at University of Washington before that. And then, of course, Giffa, who we're talking about here. They've also added a pair of front court players, Corey Chest from LSU, who was productive as a freshman last year, and James Scott, 6'10" big man from Louisville, great rebounder who should translate well into the SEC. So again, very new look roster for Coach Beard and Ole Miss. They shared the wealth really well last year. Sean Padula was their best player, but again, they could kind of beat you in multiple different ways. And looking at this roster, I'm very intrigued by kind of how that's going to work. You know, I think Giffa is going to play a big role. I think, you know, certainly Travis Perry is a guy that I think they're more inclined to have be, you know, 8th, 9th type guy. He was not super productive at Kentucky, and I don't think Ole Miss is if they're wanting to be similar level to where they were last year, which was one of the better teams in the SEC, a 6th seed in the NCAA tournament. Travis Perry can't play big minutes. So, you know, I think he can be a decent rotation piece, but he can't be a big minute guy. So if he's not playing big minutes, then you're looking at either Giffa and or Storr. Corin Johnson, if he's healthy, I think will play a pretty significant role. But I do think that Giffa is going to come in and be a big piece right away. Again, a guy who is very good at getting to the line, who scored 15 points per game for a good team last year. I think there's plenty of reason to be optimistic about this. And we know that Ole Miss was pretty heavily looking for guard additions. In fact, they were very involved in the Desmond Claude sweepstakes before he ended up at Washington. Ole Miss was a team that was in the mix alongside Alabama, like we talked about, and Gonzaga and a few others, but they missed out on Claude. They end up getting a really talented kind of consolation prize here in Keza Giffa. Sticking in the SEC with another team that was very good last year, but is going to do a lot of rebuilding, even more rebuilding than anybody else. That is Texas A&M. Bucky McMillan coming in as the head coach to replace Buzz Williams, who took that head coaching job at Maryland. A&M's had a very productive offseason, tons of talented players joining the program, including their most recent addition, a 6'6" guard from Spain, and Ruben Dominguez. And Ruben Dominguez, follows what has been a bit of a trend in the last few weeks of high-profile programs adding not only international players, but typically international players who are not of your typical freshman age. Typically, you would see guys coming over internationally who'd be 17 or 18, the same age that you would get a freshman out of the United States. But the big notable one that happened recently was Luka Bogovac, who committed to North Carolina. He was a 22-year-old Montenegrin wing. And Ruben Dominguez is also a 22-year-old wing from Spain who will be joining Texas A&M as a freshman by all accounts, despite the fact that he is 22 years old and has been playing professionally for a couple of years. This is an interesting thing that's happening, and I think we talked about this, Isaac and I did, on Monday's episode, where we talked about the House settlement and all of the stuff coming out with the House settlement and what it means for NIL and rosters and various other things. And we kind of mentioned that this may kind of be the first big step towards what eventually will be collective bargaining between student athletes and administrators in the NCAA. And I think that multi-time transfers and the inconsistency with waiver applications are going to be some of the things that could be discussed in some kind of collective bargaining. But I also wonder if they will address, like, is there going to be an age limit on bringing players over from overseas? Is there going to be some kind of compensation that goes the other direction? Like, I think that's another thing that's going to be on the list. I'm not necessarily opposed to 22-year-olds being allowed to come over to play in the United States, to play college basketball. But I do think being a 22-year-old freshman given 4 new mint years of eligibility is probably something that needs to be at least evaluated. Whether it's, hey, you can come over, but if you're over 20, you only get 2 years. If you're over 21, you only get 1 year. Something like that, I think could make some sense. But again, that's for somebody else to determine. But I do think it is going to be a conversation had in the not too distant future now that the House settlement is out of the way. Getting more into who Dominguez is, he made 35 appearances with the Spanish national team, averaged 13 points with them, helped Spain earn gold in both the U16 and U20 Euro Cup events. He also played 150 games with his pro team, Cerne Bilbao Basket. Last season, he averaged about 7.5 points and 2 rebounds in about 16 minutes per game. Very productive player, high-level shooter, very, very good three-point shooter. So he's going to add some floor spacing to Bucky McMillan's kind of wild, very press-heavy, tons of rotations, Bucky ball style of play. Should be fun to see how Dominguez can kind of translate in there. And this has been a really, again, totally new roster. I think there's only one returner for A&M, but they got a lot of really talented players joining the team. Pop Isaacs was one of their more recent additions after decommitting from Houston. He joins. Mackenzie Mbako from Indiana joins. Federico from Texas Tech. Jakari Lane from North Texas. Marcus Hill from NC State. Rashawn Agee from USC. Jamie Vincent from Texas. Zach Clements from Kansas. And Jeremiah Green coming out of high school. Those are the newcomers for this A&M team. Really excited to see how it all comes together. I think it could be a little rocky, could be a little challenging, especially early on. Any team that is a completely new look roster tends to have some growing pains early in the year, but I'm a big believer in Bucky McMillan. I'm a big believer in what he is able to do, his coaching mind. I think it's going to translate well in the SEC. It just might take a little bit of time, but I think there's trust in his ability to get this program back to a really high level. And I think Dominguez is going to be a big part of it this season, and depending how long he sticks around outside of this season as well. Well, folks, conference realignment remains a talking point in college basketball. It's got some trickle-down effects. We're way removed from the Pac-12 and everything that happened there, but there are still moves happening in part because of those moves, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Closing out the show, talking about some conference realignment news that happened late last week. We wanted to get to here on the show. Utah Valley, the Wolverines, out of the WAC, the Western Athletic Conference, have officially announced they will be joining the Big West Conference starting in the 2026-27 academic year. They are one of 2 programs leaving the WAC to go to the Big West alongside Cal Baptist. So Cal Baptist and Utah Valley moving from the WAC to the Big West, helping to replace the losses the Big West had in UC Davis and Hawaii, who were both members of the Big West, who are now going to be members of the Mountain West. The Mountain West, of course, bringing them in to offset the losses of San Diego State, Utah State, Colorado State, Fresno State, Boise State. I think that's all of them. I maybe am missing one, who are all joining Oregon State, Washington State, and Gonzaga in the new look Pac-12. So the Mountain West had to backfill. They backfill with UC Davis and Hawaii. I think they also are backfilling with Northern Illinois as well. The Big West now has to backfill after losing Davis and Hawaii. They do so by adding Utah Valley and Cal Baptist from the WAC. And you're thinking, well, how's the WAC going to backfill? Here's the unfortunate reality. The WAC might be done. The WAC is now down to just 5 programs total, because not only did they lose these 2 programs to the Big West, they also lost Grand Canyon to the Mountain West. I did not mention them as another Mountain West program that they're backfilling. From a basketball perspective, obviously, Grand Canyon does not have football, but they're a basketball edition for the Mountain West Conference. So Grand Canyon goes to the Mountain West. Seattle U is going to the WCC, and then you have these programs leaving to join the Big West. That leaves just 5 programs in the WAC starting in the 26-27 season. Yes, it's possible the WAC will find a way to replenish, to rebuild, to get back up to 8, to stay a conference, to basically survive. The WAC has always been a catch-all. I mean, for those who don't know, I used to also work at Seattle University while they were in the WAC, and at that time the conference had UMKC, so Kansas City. They had multiple programs in Texas. They had New Mexico State at the time. Like, this conference has grabbed anybody and everybody. They've done what they have needed to do to survive. This is a conference that used to have BYU and Utah and a ton of other great programs back in the day, but they have been on life support for a while. And it really feels like this move by Utah Valley and Cal Baptist was a bit of a death sentence. As of right now, again, in 26-27, the WAC will have Abilene Christian, Southern Utah, Utah Tech, Tarleton State, and UT Arlington. That is it. Those are the 5 programs remaining in the Western Athletic Conference. 4 of those teams are football schools. One of them, UT Arlington, is not a football school. But again, where do you go from here? Do you try to pull from the Big Sky? Would you even be able to pull from the Big Sky? Try to get like an Eastern Washington or Montana State or something like that. Again, they're FCS. So that would be a challenge to bring them up to FBS level for football. But again, that maybe is something worth exploring for the WAC. I'm very interested to see what happens here. I also think part of this conversation is that it feels like this was a miss by the WCC. The WCC, a conference that has been praised a lot under new commissioner Stu Jackson for their ability to kind of be ahead of the curve and be proactive as opposed to being reactive. Rumors had been swirling for Gonzaga leaving the WCC for years, and the WCC responded to that by reaching out, and obviously they lost BYU, and they reach out and they snag Oregon State and Washington State as affiliate members during this 2-year kind of grace period for those programs before the Pac-12 is rebuilt. And so they bring these programs in as affiliate members. It's a big boost to the viewership of the WCC. They also go out and get Seattle U. They had also landed Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon eventually just changed their mind and pulled out of their deal, which is an ongoing lawsuit, by the way, between the WCC and Grand Canyon. But those were shrewd moves by the conference to kind of not only stay alive and stay afloat, but like be proactive about trying to keep themselves as one of the more premier non-power conference programs in the sport. And then Gonzaga ends up leaving for the Pac-12, and Grand Canyon ends up leaving for the Mountain West. And Oregon State and Washington State, we know, are going to be done after this year. And so the conference is going to be down to 9 schools, including Seattle U. And it felt to me like when you look at the premier non-football basketball programs on the West Coast that could have been had, Utah Valley and Cal Baptist were 2 of the very best. Utah Valley's a team that Mark Pope coached there for a while. Mark Madsen coached there for a while, 2 now power conference program coaches. And this team under Todd Phillips, their 3rd coach, who's been successful. Phillips went 25-9 last year at Utah Valley. They were 112th at KenPom for a program in the WAC. They lost to San Francisco in the first round of the NIT, and they were very close to making their first NCAA tournament appearance, but they lost to Grand Canyon in the WAC championship. This team has been top 200 at KenPom in 8 of the last 9 years. And I know top 200 doesn't sound super sexy or anything like that, but for a relatively small mid-major program that's only been D1 for less than 2 decades, to be top 200 in 8 out of 9 years, they've also been top 150 at KenPom in 6 of the last 9 years. So this team has been pretty consistently one of the top half teams in all of college basketball, one of the top teams in the Western Athletic Conference. By the way, Cal Baptist has had a similar, not quite as consistent, but similar amount of success as well. And the WCC could have brought 2 pretty solid basketball programs that fit geographically. I mean, Cal Baptist is right around where many of the other programs in the conference already are. Utah's a little bit out of the way, but they had BYU for a decade, so it's not like it's crazy to think that this conference could add a school in the state of Utah. And they swung and missed, or maybe they didn't take a swing. I don't know what happened here, but it sure feels like these were programs that would have been very logical fits in the WCC that now join the Big West, which, is a great fit for them. The Big West was a good basketball conference last year as well. UC Irvine and UC San Diego were both NCAA tournament caliber teams. The committee did not choose Irvine as an at-large bid, but UC San Diego got a 12 seed, gave Michigan a big run for their money in the first round as well. So this is a good basketball program. Joining Utah Valley and Cal Baptist, solid basketball programs, joining a decent basketball conference. But it does feel like the WCC could have made a move here and either opted not to or tried to and failed, which if they tried and got outbid by the Big West, that's not great. If they didn't try, that's maybe not great either, because the options are dwindling for the conference. Some of the options include these leftovers from the WAC, but as we said earlier, 4 of these 5 programs have football. So they seem more likely to go to Conference USA or to the Southland or somewhere like that, where they can kind of keep their football and just keep everything in one conference. I think the WCC trying to make a big push for like a Tarleton State or an Abilene Christian is going to be tough for a couple of reasons. One, every program in the WCC is on the West Coast. Every program in that conference is either in California or Oregon, or now Washington with Seattle U replacing Gonzaga. So they're all on the West Coast. And you throw out, you'd have to add multiple. If it's just Tarleton or just Abilene Christian, those programs would be logistically travel nightmares for the current teams in the conference as well as for themselves. And they'd be joining a conference that doesn't have football. It just doesn't make sense for them to do that. Maybe you get UT Arlington because they don't have football. But again, they're on a complete island if they're in the WCC. So as somebody who follows the WCC very closely, I'm a little bit worried about the long-term viability of this conference. As somebody who's also followed the WAC fairly closely, I'm not even worried about the future of the WAC. I think it's it. I think it's done. I just, again, maybe they can pull something together, grab a few teams, get up to the minimum of 8 and make this thing work. But I think that it might be folding. I think this might be it for the WAC. Which is unfortunate, a conference that has a rich history that just was completely picked apart by conference realignment and kept trying to survive, trying to rebuild, trying to make this thing work. And I think it's finally time to put this conference to rest, which is, again, an unfortunate reality of conference realignment in a lot of ways. We'll see what happens. It's not done yet. Maybe things will change. We'll see if the WCC makes a move to land some of these schools, if they end up just going back to the Southland or Conference USA, what ends up happening there. But it will be something we'll keep an eye on here on Locked On College Basketball. Folks, thank you so much for making the show your first listen, your first watch of the day. That is going to wrap it up for me and for Roman today. We had a lot of fun talking Desmond Claude to UW, talking about those SEC moves as well. We'll be back later this week. More going on here. We'll continue to talk about some non-conference schedules as those are coming together for teams like UConn and Kansas. Keep you up to date on the transfer portal and recruiting, both domestically and internationally. And we'll keep you up to date on NBA draft stuff as we get closer and closer to the draft at the end of the month. Thanks again, folks. Have a fantastic rest of your day. As always, we want to say apologies to the Lawyer family. Let's go Wild Popes. Cheers to the McBruins. And until next time, peace out.